week we talked about sort of Brueggemann's perspective and said that Sabbath is an act of resistance against the empire. That's one of the words Brueggemann likes to use here. Okay. So it's an act of resistance. It's pushing back against the systems that oppress other people. It's pushing back against the economic engine that drives our world. Welcome, Nancy.
Good morning.
Good morning. So just y'all's thoughts. Did any of that stay with you? Did have any ideas come to you since then?
Well, I like that we opened up talking about not thinking about the Sabbath as we can't do, because that really was my nature. Not that I don't do all the things you're not supposed to do, but
yeah.
No, I agree. It struck me as I thought about it during the week, how much more of a gift the Sabbath is.
John.
Really keeping everybody going. I'd rather be in front of y'all.
Cheryl, I totally agree with the positive, what the Sabbath is. What the Sabbath is not, and it does feel like resistance. And this morning was one of those days, I've got a list like this, and to not even think about doing any of that today, which I may think about it, but I'm not even writing it. Well, that's not. But it's hard. It is hard in our type A, get things accomplished. And some Sundays it's harder than others.
The Brueggemann talked about multitasking when and he tells the story of a man in his congregation, his his Christian congregation, growing up, who would always slip out. He ran the stores. He would always slip out early to have the store open when everybody got there, and he realized that what Mr. whatever his name was he was multitasking. He was doing the work while he was celebrating Sabbath, and that's the resistance, not to do that. And you're right, it is hard. I'm not standing up here saying that I practice, but I appreciate the perspective both of Brueggemann and today of Heschel. It's hard.
One other way of thinking about it, to make it more positive, we once met a Jewish couple who kept kosher at certain times, and in talking to them about it, they said they saw keeping kosher as an act of worship, and therefore they didn't worry when they didn't keep kosher, but they viewed it positively when they did. And I thought that was a great way to think about it.
And it also, keeping kosher doesn't feel like work.
Exactly.
You think of it like
Or
worship.
a duty, and if you missed it, then it was the end of the world.
And similarly, then if we think about Sabbath in the positive, it doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, here's another day where I do nothing, which is the way I felt growing up when my parents would, we would go for a ride in the country, which as a young person felt incredibly boring.
I think our culture does a pretty good job, of having the concept of a weekend where you change perspective. At least, whatever you thought of as your work, there are days when you're supposed to change perspective, and that can take a lot of different forms. And hopefully in Sabbath, that also means you think a little bit about God.
Yeah, true. It doesn't just mean that you can have brunch on Sundays. You're right. And that I think is the, keeping kosher. Worship is part of it. It sets it apart in some way. Even if the rest of the day you're addressing the list, which is what I'm doing.
And instead of addressing the list, to go take a walk, to do something that is really nourishing, spiritually nourishing, is a super positive part of it.
Yeah. So nice segue into a little activity. For you folks on Zoom, I sent this handout yesterday, but I will read it to you. Just pass it around.
Thank you.
Hey, Jen.
it is impossible for you to do.
And anybody?
You're gonna have to turn over.
So, so the questions are obvious here, they're pretty straightforward. The front page should be the page that says, what gives me life that I never take time to do it? So if you will, just sit and think about that for a little while, and after you've given that some time, flip it over and just list the reasons why it seems impossible to be able to do that. And it may not seem impossible, that's hyperbole to make it like that, to spend a little time in that. So if you will wrap that up, and it's okay if you haven't finished, this might be something that you keep thinking about. If you're willing to share, I'd love to hear some of the reasons why you think the stuff on the other side is impossible.
I realized it was attitudinal and easy to see things in other people. But I have a family member who has to do things that are unpleasant and views it as frittering away time to do things that are pleasant, and feels guilty when they do things that are pleasant. And I realize there's some of that in me too. So,
Yeah, that's a good observation, that you don't, I'm gonna put words in your mouth, you don't feel worthy of spending the time.
I have two kind of reactions. One is just this one everybody has, oh, I don't have time for that, which the typical thing that goes away first is a daily Bible study. I don't know, that tends to go away first. And, well, I mean, I read my email and some other things in the paper. And why, I mean, there's really no excuse. The priorities that somehow misset. The more interesting one, when I reflect on this, was one thing. So I said travel was always one I really wanted to do, and exploring. And I have two things that cut down on that. One is actually volunteer commitments that keep our schedule. That's our work, and both of us have a lot of these things, and it makes it a little tricky to do some of this stuff. But the other, it was COVID, and it's about gone, hopefully. So one of them's going away.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
It was impossible at one point. That true. Yeah, so thank you. So, and I think one of the points that you're making, which is it's obvious, is that to do the things on the list, you don't have time because you're spending your time some other way. And at some level, you've made a choice to do that. I mean, you've made a choice to do volunteer work, but at some point, also, it doesn't involve a choice. It's a matter of, well, it does involve a choice. It involves a choice of actually doing those things that bring us life. So, any others thoughts on?
Also, things like, I like to do things like fishing and bird watching. But it gets ruined because, in a way, it can get ruined because people say, well, how many did you catch? Or, I remember bird walking, how many birds we identified, and how far did you hike? That's not the point here, that's not the point.
Exactly.
The point is to just get into that environment, basically observe, do nothing, let it absorb it.
Yeah.
To me, that's soul fulfilling to do that.
That's a
So
really good
I have to go back, I have to go back.
It doesn't have to, that's right. But it got away. It doesn't have to be measured, so, I mean, that's a good observation too.
Well, I obviously thought about what does she mean by, and I just decided it's probably more secular than you intended, but it was that kind of that state that they call flow, when what you're doing, you're so immersed in it and so involved in it that time goes by and you're not aware of it. And and so I thought, well, and I realized I do make time for those things, but not the Bible study and all that stuff.
No, and that's okay. I think you answered the question the way I did, which is what makes me feel alive. And that's a great segue into what Heschel talks about. He sets up his book in this way, saying that we live in space, not outer space, but we live in this three-dimensional world. And we tend to see time going by us. We tend to just see it passing by, and we think in terms of, oh my gosh, I've only got 2.5 days before my exam, or only, how am I gonna fit that in? Or, gosh, it's only, I saw Penn, and he said, I did think that 1 month from today, I go on sabbaticals. We tend to think about time passing by us, when in reality, we are moving through time. And that's where I have used the word dimension. It's different from the three-dimensional world we live in itself. I think of it as a fourth dimension, although that's not necessarily the language that Brueggemann uses. So what we end up doing as real humans is we try to conquer our space. We stake out boundaries. We say, this is mine. We say, I'm going to go get my coffee and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to do this. So I'm moving in space, and we lose sight that we are also moving through time. And so Heschel says, let me tell you, some of you all may know Abraham Heschel. He was a Jewish rabbi, born in Poland, moved to Germany, and escaped in 1938, first I think to Switzerland, and ended up in the United States. Most of his family was killed in the Holocaust, which I'm sure has shaped his life, but he emphasized a philosophical approach to Judaism. He was less about halakha, about the law, about Torah study, more philosophy, although he was obviously versed in all that. Sabbath was very important to him. Time, the idea of time was very important to him. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. He was an activist in the 60s, died in 1972. So that's who it is. But he says that we set up, we fight, we try to conquer time, when in fact we can only move through it. So he argues that in Sabbath, we're actually inhabiting time. I was using earlier, I was using the language we step out of, and it's not a physical step out of, but we inhabit time differently. And it is not a time like that folds back on itself, or a black hole, or that's any kind of changed time. It's just that we're participating in the time that's already happened, and we become aware of it. So I want to show you a video of, it's not actually, it's a photograph of Heschel. But he's talking about this idea of time and what it means to him. And I will show you, when you'll see just a moment on my screen, this, I'll show you this, which is a lot of the transcript. And I know it's tiny, but it will, at least if you're like me, I'm kind of visual, so I like to hear it too. So this is Joshua Heschel. This actually is a photograph of it. Listen to him.
The ultimate truth is not to be found in space, but in time. God is closer to time than to space. You hear me? An important beginning for religious reflection is to ponder the meaning of time. Right? I suggest to you that in Judaism, time is very important, tremendously important. Now, what is time? If I may very briefly suggest a few definitions, I would say time is continuous creation. Time is God's presence in the world of space. Time is holy. The present moment is the presence of God. Therefore, one ought to have reverence all the time for the presence of time. In a very deep sense, Judaism is a religion of time. Tells you what to do with the moment. Judaism as a religion may be defined as sanctification of time. Every moment is a great opportunity for sanctification, for goodness, for service. Every moment. God is present in time. You want to search for God, not necessarily go to the peak of a mountain, but the depth of a forest. Just ponder the moment in the mystery of time. So I say to you, The real piety of a Jew is related to the sensitivity of time. Every moment is holy. Therefore, it calls upon us to respond to the way it really is. So marvelous to be alive. Such a joy to be a contemporary of God. But very few of us did. It's the means of existence to be aware of what is being a contemporary of God. Every moment is an opportunity, an endless opportunity to accomplish and to succeed. The true image of man is to be understood in time. A human being is not a piece of body in space. He's time. Time is a great mystery. The dignity of man is in his being time. Man lives in space, but he is time.
So it's better to hear from, and I'll leave that up for a moment, from him, for him to describe it than from me, but what stood out to you all?
What strikes me is that he is being very forthright about the value of time, and that we honor God by using the time that is afforded us as precious and limited and holy, and something that we should glorify God with this, or that our acts would glorify God with this use of time that we have.
My thought was back to the first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. That's what is man's chief end? And the answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever.
What sticks out to me here is that he's really emphasizing that present moment, like you were talking about, that's where God's presence is in that, in the present moment. It's not so much, we always think about the using time like it's a bucket of that, we only have a gallon of it, and we gotta win it, I don't know, we're pouring it out or something like that, but it's always there with us. And somehow getting that appreciation of that is a really interesting thing. It's similar to the current version you hear a lot now is mindfulness, and I find that very important, and it's really hard for me sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. Sometimes I need to think about the present moment, not the future or the past. That's the stuff that gets your mind off the track, and you can't.
Yeah, multitasking is not mentioned there.
Right. And Jane?
I think we've been so great to use time wisely. That's what you've heard during, at least I know I've heard it a lot. And so I don't remember who said it, but somebody said, I always feel guilty for doing things that are enjoyable or relaxing or what have you, because I'm so conditioned that, to your point, we only have so much time in a day. And so we've got to make sure we get all these things done and checked off the list, and there's all these obligations, and these people, relying on us. And so we just kind of get in this, just this cycle of it, And by the time you think, okay, I've done enough on my list that I can sit down and have quiet time, or I can go for a walk or whatever, you're either too tired or you don't have the energy, like the mental energy to really kind of be mindful of whatever that moment's gonna be.
To that point, I like the part about, you don't have to go to the top of the mountain or the depths of a forest, or I would even say you don't have to come to a church or go into a chapel to seek God's presence. That's, focus on where it is, where you are, and where the time that you are at now. So that is.
Yeah, and it's an invitation into that time. And Jane, thank you for your comment. Jane, on Zoom, the leading comment Jane made was, we've been told to, quote, use time wisely. If you couldn't hear her at the back of the room, but yeah, I think that's important, and we're being invited into a reprioritization of time. And God commanded Sabbath. I mean, even says in Scripture that you die if you don't practice Sabbath. So it was, it was a commandment that made you do that made you set aside that time. And we were being invited into it. as well. There was a line in there that stuck out to me. He said, that's the meaning of existence, to be aware of being contemporary of God. You ever thought of yourself as being contemporary of God?
I will just say I was struck by that phrase and certainly don't consider myself in that vein.
Sorry, I didn't mean to start this PowerPoint. Yes, I agree with you, but if you break down the word, as I worked through it, our Tuesday Bible study did this book, so we spent 3 weeks on it. So fortunately, I've had a lot of conversation partners, but as I think through it, the word contemporary means with time. So we're with God in time, and that's what Heschel is saying, and what he is saying about Sabbath, to get us more specifically to our topic. I have a video about Shabbat, about Sabbath, but I think I'm going to keep moving because I think most of you all know that Jews celebrate the Sabbath at sundown Friday evening. They welcome it in with the lighted candles. There's some good stuff in the video, but I won't spend time doing it. Another thing, I kind of think in images and diagrams, and so this one was a meaningful diagram to me, understanding that Sabbath was meaningful to God because God practiced it on the seventh day. And I had to send around the, this is some scripture that we've been looking at, just so it's in front of you. So it's important to God. God experienced it, God commanded it. But it's also important to humans because it was commanded by God. And so we have this sort of setup. We also see that, sorry, I'm going to downsize this. And this is the Genesis passage that it's on your handout. There's some excerpts, but that God made it holy. So God made Sabbath holy, but we are also commanded to make it holy. And we get the passage, but both the Exodus passage and the one that we read last week from Deuteronomy say, keep it holy. So we're making it holy, and God is making it holy. But as I thought through this diagram for myself, it was lacking in that it feels like there's a separation between God and humans. And Sabbath is what is between us. So I altered my diagram to make it look like this. And when we participate in Sabbath, we are participating in God's time. So does that make sense?
Sounds like what Herschel is.
Heschel.
Heschel.
Yeah. Yeah, my language is a little bit different. I'd say we're in God's presence, which is probably from a Jewish standpoint, they might not have said that because no one was really in God's presence. But that's what it feels like to me. So we exist in this time with God when we were practicing Sabbath, and we allow an awareness of it. As you said, Rich, it's always there. I think what you said, time is always there. But when we participate in it, we are aware. We then don't save our life-giving things to at the end of our to-do list, which is that's so neat. And I'm like that too, in terms of thinking, gosh, I haven't earned, I haven't done enough to have earned to be able to do a crossword puzzle or play the piano or do an extra 45 minutes of yoga on top of my 45 minutes in it. So anyway, that is sort of the way I'm thinking about it. So
And Gerald, I mean, for an illustration, it makes me think of the Mary and Martha story. Just being in the presence of Jesus or scurrying around, making sure everything's done. So that was a human illustration of what I think you're thinking about.
That's a great illustration. And Jesus says something like, you will always, you won't always have me. You won't always have this presence of Jesus's embodiment. So you should be practicing the present moment. That's a great illustration. I've tended too often to be the Martha.
Oh, exactly.
So, if we're inhabiting God's time there, and I'll take this down so we can see each other. If we're inhabiting God's time, then, and we think of it as holy time, holy meaning set apart or sanctified in some way, consecrated in some way. And if we're practicing that Sabbath, this seems like an obvious question, but just to get us to think about it, what is the quality of our time? I mean, what is that time like if we've kept it holy and we are in that presence?
I think of it sort of as a listening time. I mean, it's a quiet time of just listening for God's interaction with us.
Attentiveness.
Yeah.
Back to your point, Rich, mindfulness. It feels like that to me as well.
And it shouldn't be positive. It shouldn't be a chore in your mind.
Right. I think, and that's kind of how you started our conversation today, Nina, is that to begin to think of it in a positive way as opposed to something
Like
that
a gift to you, not
Yeah.
a chore.
So Heschel says that things change in Sabbath, and I keep saying in Sabbath as opposed to on Sabbath because in my mind that feels less like a calendar item, a day of the week. So when you're participating in Sabbath, and I'll give you 3 examples of kind of what he sees changes. The first one, and I'm going to read just a paragraph in the book, is he says, time then is otherness, a mystery that hovers above all categories. It is as if time and the mind were a world apart. Yet it is only within time that there is fellowship and togetherness of all beings. Every one of us occupies a portion of space. He takes it up exclusively. The portion of space which my body occupies is taken up by myself in exclusion to anyone else. Yet no one possesses time. There is no moment which I possess exclusively. This very moment belongs to all living men, women, humankind, as it belongs to me. We share time, but we own space. Through my ownership of space, I'm a rival of all other beings. Through my living in time, I am a contemporary of all other beings. We pass through time, we occupy space. What do you hear in that? If you can put it in your words.
I heard it as that we're all given the gift of being part of time. And it's almost like we're given, how we're already forgiven before we sin. I feel like it's that, right? So we're already given this gift to have the space for mindfulness and peace and things like that. But I guess it's a little bit up to us to make sure that we are obviously taking it, but present in it.
Yeah.
So that's whatever.
So a choice, it's definitely a
Yeah,
choice.
right.
Yeah. Any thoughts from, so James at the back of the room, James, I guess Justin is at the back of the room. So, and will you?
Sure,
say
I
that
was
again?
just saying that I think that we're all given the gift of having time and space and to be present with God. It's just that we need to be mindful to think about taking advantage of, being part of that moment, right? I think it's just a gift we're given automatically.
Yeah.
It's not something we have to earn.
Right, which feels like grace in Christian terms. Or
It sounds, to me like space is more me time, whereas time for collective time, thinking about others, not just yourself. It's a broader thing if we're all going through it at the same time.
I like the idea that everyone possesses time. No, I shouldn't say possesses time. Everybody exists in time equally. So I'm no different than anybody else in this space. And we sort of talked last week, we used the phrase that Sabbath is a great equalizer of the Walmart executive, the Walmart cashier and the CEO on a picnic blanket, you can't tell them apart. That's part of what Barbara Brown Taylor said. So I think of it that way, that we have this opportunity to live in a space, to inhabit inhabit a space, I won't say space, inhabit time in a way that we share it with others. So I'm going to go to the next one, and which is related to this, and that is that time is the presence of God in the world of space. It's two parts, so I'm going to stop there. Just remind ourselves from we're reading from a Jewish perspective, but from our Christian mind, when have we seen the presence of God in the world of space? Jesus. So Jesus did occupy this three-dimensional world, but that's just on the side. So his statement is time is the presence of God in the world of space, and it is within time that we are able to sense the unity of all beings. So again, this collective experience of seeing all people together. And then the final thing that he shared, not the final thing, but another thing that he shared, I only picked three, is he tells of a legend that says that light at the beginning of time was different than the light created on the fourth day. This is a legend, you know? And that the light that was created, that was existent at the beginning of time, allowed humankind to see from beginning to end. That's the word that's used. And humans were not worthy of it. You know, maybe a saint or maybe a sage, a pious sage, he says, could see it on Sabbath. But it was this awareness of the continuum of time. So all of this says to me that in this space that we occupy, in this presence of God, in this, and when we live in time, we have what Richard Bohr uses the phrase unitive consciousness, which means a lot to me. It means something to me, that it's the sense that we are all in this together, and we have a vision of that when we practice this kind of Sabbath presence. Stop there for a moment.
So do you mean all of us currently alive, or do you mean the whole?
I would say, I think you can think of it either way. You can think of all of humanity that exists.
But I mean, you know, with God, it's not so linear as we are.
Exactly. Yeah, so, and I'm not saying that when we participate in Sabbath, we can see the end of time. I mean, I'm not saying that at all. That's a legend, but it's an implication that gives you this little image into it.
Garrell,
Yeah.
I watched something this morning that I think speaks directly to this. The Times had a video that was produced of the war in Ukraine, and there were various and sundry snippets and how people are suffering. And there was a gentleman that, I'm not sure what faith he was aligned, but looked to be local, who was praying. And I thought, the whole world is praying with you. I have sensed across the world a lot of empathy and God's presence in response to the evil that has come forth in the form of Putin and this war. And I don't know that there's been that kind of unifying force in a spiritual sense for me worldwide that I have witnessed in quite a while. And that I lost Gerald. The prayer really brought it together for me as this man was praying with 4 or 5 people that were clearly, directly ravaged by this thing, and they're watching relatives get killed, and just the pain and suffering. I felt God's presence there. I really did, in a strong way that these are people across the world. And I think God's reaching out in a universal sense in this regard.
And to me, and I'm making a leap here, but it almost suggests that prayer is a practice of being in the presence of God. Not almost, it is a practice of being in the presence of God, but it illustrates that really well, I think, that, through prayer, we feel a oneness with God. So the final thing, thank you, John, that does contemporize it. It makes us see it in a more relevant terms. So the other thing that Heschel indicates, and this is sort of the thrust of his whole book, really, is this idea that we get a glimpse of the world God intends, the eternity, when we celebrate Sabbath. I think of these things that bring us life. Those are the things that when we are living in eternity, we'll have those we'll do those all the time. And so I appreciate that this is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs with a great essay in his commentary on Exodus. But he says that Sabbath is a full dress rehearsal for an ideal society that has not yet come to pass, but will do, because we know what we are aiming for, because we experienced it at the beginning. His at the beginning reference really is having seen Eden and seen that it was good. That's sort of where he's coming from. But we have this dress rehearsal for the kingdom. And I think when Jesus says phrases like, your kingdom come, or in that day, or at the time of, he is talking about this God time, that we live into this future place. So, at some point, I think as Christians, we then see ourselves in eternity as this full participation in God. This is just my interpretation of it. Jews might not think of it this way, but I do see that eventually that's where we are. And when we are in Sabbath, we experience a taste of that. So thoughts as we wrap up for worship.
It gives you all positive reason to want to yearn for Sabbath.
Yes.
More than just, yeah, I could or I couldn't, but it's really, for Christians, it should be something we desire.
Yeah.
Desire to do.
The Jews, and Heschel talks about that one of their images is the bridegroom going out to meet the bride. It's this joy, and you get dressed in your finest clothes, you take a bath, and they describe taking a bath, just bathe every day in today's times. And when the sages were talking about it, it's probably a big deal. But there's this joy at welcoming the Sabbath at sundown that I don't experience. That was one of the things that came out of our Bible study discussion, is that people haven't thought of Sabbath as, welcoming that time and welcoming. I think if we all did it, we would all be participating in it together. Anything else?
But I do see it in, it's just kind of forming in my mind. I appreciate you thinking about this time stuff. Gerald knows I'm into dimensional thinking about God. I like to think about God as a higher dimensional being, and that way of understanding by analogy. There's things about God that we can't appreciate or understand, but by understanding the analogy, we can, it gives us an appreciation. So I really do see it here. I mean, I always thought of God as time as dimension, and we are moving through that, but not, like you said. And God is not tied to God is outside that dimension and sees time much more, can see the whole thing, somehow is independent, has ability of movement in that dimension that we just don't have at all.
Right.
And so I'm just acknowledging that, and I kind of see, I think it is this theme here. I was trying to even see if it was Sabbath, but as we're moving through here, God's independent. I think when we get to eternity, we will be more in that independent dimension. But for now, this moment is the only time that we have the same abilities as God at this time. I'm not abilities, that's the wrong word to say. We're in this moment with God. Worrying about the future, God can handle that, but we can't do it. It's impossible. Past, we can't change it. That's impossible. So we should spend our time in this moment, and later we will have that more full
Right.
thing. So I don't know. I'm reiterating, but telling you that yes, I do see it in a
Yeah.
dimensional way.
Yeah, I love that, and that single point, the present. Greg Worrell has a great phrase, the luminous now. Just love that. That's where we inhabit. That's where we live, and when we live in that, we live in oneness with everyone else, experiencing the luminous now. And we can't, we can go no faster or no slower than time. We cannot. There's no way we can conquer it. We can only recognize that we exist in it. I meant to say this earlier, that there's the joke of the fishbowl, and there's an old fish and a couple of young fish, and the old fish swims by the younger fish and goes, "Water's great, ain't it, boys?" And the little fish, the two fish look at each other and go, "What's water?" There's this complete lack of awareness of what we're in the midst of. So anyway, I love the topic, and I really appreciate your participation today.
You've given us a lot to think about.
Yeah. Well, I think it's Heschel. I've always loved this book, so it's fun to be able to talk about it with y'all. So thank you all who've joined us by Zoom. We're always glad to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.